As always, I have a standing rule. If you disagree with me on any matter under the sun, raise your hand, you go first.
All right, so how this is going to work is we're going to have people go around the back and line up in a line along one side of the aisle, and then you'll come here, stand on the pink X. I'll hold the microphone for you, and then you can ask your one question, okay?
1 minute long.
Yep. You ready? Yep, right on pink X. Good?
Howdy, go for it.
Hello. I see a lot of similarities between you and Jordan Peterson. What are your thoughts on the Jordan Peterson revolution?
I mean, I love Jordan. I know Professor Peterson relatively well at this point, and I think he's doing an awful lot of good. We looked at each other the other day. We were having a conversation on Dave Rubin's show, and we looked at each other and we said, how is it that we found a huge market for saying things like, take responsibility for your own life and tell the truth? Like, how is this a big market proposition? And it just shows the radicalism of society right now, that this is considered an underground subversive thought when you say, make good decisions and maybe you'll have a better life. So the fact that Jordan says that, the fact that I say that, I think that, all credit to Jordan. I think that he's a really interesting thinker. I like his lectures on religion. Our divisions are largely about whether it's a matter of religion being useful or religion being true. But we start from the same fundamental premises about the value of reason in a society that seems to have lost its mind. And so good for Jordan. I mean, that interview with Kathy Newman is everything, right? The interview with him on BBC, which I talked about on my show, is just spectacular because being Kathy Newman is something that everybody on the right has to go through. If you're on the right, the media will take your views, pretend that those are not your views, that instead what you actually believe is something vile, evil, and nasty, and then attribute those views to you in front of you. And Jordan is one of the people who I've sort of deemed the Bartleby group for fans of Melville. There's just a certain group of people who just say no. Right? I'm not going to do that. And Jordan is one of those people. I think there are people on the left, by the way, who are like this. I think Sam Harris is one of those people. Somebody who I disagree with strenuously on a lot of topics. But when he was on with Bill Maher and talking about the problems with fundamentalist Islam, and Ben Affleck went after him, he basically said, no, I'm not going to do that. And I think that a society that's so skewed that simply saying no to basic propositions that are false is now popular. It says more about our society than it says about either Jordan or me. We were looking at each other and going, are we the best that society has to offer right now? Are we the best thinkers? Because if so, we are so screwed.
First of all, I just wanted to say I'm a huge fan of yours. You've distracted me from my own school because you're like my new school. I obsessively watch your videos.
What's your major?
I'm a business administration major.
Okay, so you may be learning more from me then.
I mean, I've learned more about capitalism and how our system actually works from you than any other class.
Oh, thank you, I appreciate it.
But yeah, my question was, what is your opinion on labels in general? So obviously, there's a difference between leftists and liberals.
Yes.
Do you think it's important to saying if you say I'm a conservatism or I'm a conservative, but yet you hold some leftist views or some liberal views, do you think you should be saying I should be saying I'm a conservative then?
I mean, so I think that if I were to make a fundamental distinction between conservative thought and leftist thought, conservative thought says that when in conflict, individual rights trump communal rights, and leftist thought says that when in conflict, communal rights trump individual rights. That's the very shorthand, very, very shorthand description of the ideologies. Obviously, there's some play in the definitions. If in the best of all possible worlds, we would all be able to have just a giant list of our issue resumes, all the things we feel about various issues, and then we wouldn't have to use labels. But it's useful shorthand. The truth is that you can usually tell within 5 minutes of talking to somebody, at least I can, where they stand politically on the spectrum. And if you are conservative because you believe in personal responsibility and individual rights that pre-exist government, and a government that was designed specifically in order to protect those rights, not in order to provide you positive rights, not in order to give you things that belong to other people, then you are conservative even if you may stray on various smaller issues, I think. Thanks.
Hey, Mr. Shapiro, thanks for coming. It's a great honor to listen to you speak. And
thank you.
Coming all the way out to Minnesota in the cold. So we all know your opinions and feelings about Donald Trump and why you chose not to vote for him in the election cycle. I guess my question is there ever a point where you think it's more important to stop a radical leftist ideology or candidate rather than vote for someone who adequately promulgates conservative ideology and morals? Or I guess, in simpler words, does the lesser of two arguments, or the lesser of two evils argument, ever hold water for you?
So I think the lesser of evils argument can hold water, but you have to be talking about something that is an absolute incurable evil. Because otherwise what you do is you fall into a trap where every single election becomes a lesser of two evils argument, which is basically what we've had for, since Reagan, I'd say. It's a serious problem because all the parties have to do is run somebody who's slightly less crappy than the other party, and then we're all supposed to throw up our hands and say, oh, hallelujah, we just saved the country by voting for someone. Now, this is not a referendum on what President Trump has done so far. I like a lot of what President Trump has done policy-wise. I'm far more skeptical of President Trump rhetorically. I think that the president has done, continues to do severe damage to the comedy in the country and the possibility of building a social fabric, which I actually think is a really important thing. That said, I never said during the election cycle that I didn't understand the lesser of two evils argument. I just didn't think it applied simply because I thought that there was another long-term consideration, which was what happens if, for example, Trump is so unpopular that even if he gives me some of the things I want, he blows out conservatism. In 2018, the Republicans lose Congress, and in 2020, Kamala Harris is president with a Democratic Congress. Right? That was a serious political consideration. Also, there are serious considerations about the views of young people that are being shaped right now in electoral politics. If they look at President Trump and they see him as the face of conservatism, is that too toxic? And is that going to be what people see of conservatism now, is the guy who, during the campaign, pretended he didn't know what the KKK was, for example, right? That was my main critique of Trump as a candidate. Now, we're a year and a half past his election, and there's new evidence. So some of the evidence suggests that he is actually governing like a conservative. I think a lot of the damage that I was afraid of him doing to the country basically has already occurred. So the question is, how much more damage can he do to the country on some of these levels? I don't know that the answer is all that high. I think that he's basically become, what I've said is he's now the strong efficient markets theory, right? That all the information is now priced in. He could legitimately shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and no one's opinion of him would change. Right? He could come out front of the White House and strangle puppies, and everybody who likes him would say that puppy absolutely deserved it. And everybody who dislikes him would say that he does this on a routine basis. We'll have to evaluate where we are in 2020 because it's 3 years away. But in answer to your original question, does it ever apply? Yes, it applies, but I think that we have to be very sparing about its use because it's very easy to move from lesser of two evils argument to the end justifies the means. Right? Those two arguments are closely related, and the ends justifies the means argument is one of the most dangerous arguments a human being can make.
Would you vote for Donald Trump if the election were today?
If the election were today, I'd lean toward it. Because, again, I think that the president has done a lot of things I didn't think he was going to do. And I think that the system has constrained him in ways that, were unforeseen. Also, I think most of the damage that he has done and continues to do has already been done. I think that if all the damage has been done, if the hole is already in the boat, I'm not sure that the situation is bettered by a Democrat taking over with the hole in the boat at this point.
All right. I'll preface my question by saying that I admire your work for a number of different reasons, and perhaps what I find most admirable about you is your strict sense of ethnic and religious identity as a Jew. Your Jewish background has clearly played a significant role in influencing or shaping the political, social, and cultural ideals and values that you have, as well as your support for Israel as a nation state. So, I'm wondering, Ben, do you support the classical definition of a nation as being demographically and culturally homogenous, like that of Israel, similar to the definition that American forefathers generally upheld, with exceptions, of course, until the Hart-Celler Immigration Act of 1965?
Okay, so one, I want to correct a mischaracterization. You said that I take a lot of pride in my ethnic and religious identity. I take no pride in my ethnic identity. I take a lot of pride in my religious identity. So there are a lot of people who have been born Jews who I just don't care about. Right? Like Noam Chomsky was born Jewish. He's a schmuck. Like I don't care at all. Bernie Sanders, born Jewish, schmuck. Like I don't. So the point that I'm making is that religious identity is a different thing because that's a set of ideas and values. Religion is creedal, in the same way the American Declaration of Independence is creedal. So when it comes to the definition of a nation, I would say that it is very important that a nation have a creed in common. I'm not particularly interested in having an ethnicity in common. When they say that Israel, for example, is ethnically homogenous, that's just not true. Israel is filled with Russian Jews and Ethiopian Jews and Yemeni Jews. My wife is a Moroccan Jew. So just because they all have a religion in common doesn't make them ethnically identical by any stretch of the imagination. Right? Again, it's pretty hard to find somebody who's more ethnically non-identical than a Russian Jew and an Ethiopian Jew. So the reason that I believe in Israel as a nation state is not for ethnic reasons. It's because of religious observance reasons, that Israel is a place where the religion of Judaism can thrive and be safe, which I think is an important thing. And I think the same thing is true in the United States when it comes to the creed of the United States. I think America is a creedal country. I think it's what has made America great. Now, that's not to say that everybody who comes into the country has an equal capacity to assimilate to that creed. The assimilation capacity of people, I don't think, has to do much with ethnic identity. I think it does have to do with cultural identity. I think there are cultures that come into the country, people who come from various cultures, who may not be as easily able to assimilate, because obviously that's just the case. I mean, there are people who come in and they already know English. There are people who come in and they've already had a history with Western democracy. There are people who come in and they've never seen a gay person before, and in their old country, gay people were caned and killed. So it's important to recognize that cultures are not the same thing as ethnicities. And I think it's a dangerous game to play when we say that that ethnicity means culture when they clearly do not mean anything of the sort.
Hey, Ben. How are you?
Doing okay. How are you?
I'm good. So unlike everyone else here, I'm actually a high schooler. I'm the secretary of our Young Americans for Freedom Charter.
Great.
And we fought really hard to try to get you to come to our school, too, but they shut us down every way they could. I know I got to keep this short, but I wanted to ask you, what's the best way as secretary I can reach out to young people who may not know what conservatism is, and how can I inspire them to join the movement that pretty much you lead?
Well, that's very kind of you. Not sure I lead it, but that's nice of you. I think that as far as how to get people to join the movement, people join movements because they see flashpoints in culture. Right? The way that people most engage, I can tell this from the way that people sort of find my content. Most of the people who listen to my show, for example, originally engaged because they saw a short video of me on YouTube or Facebook talking about race or transgenderism or something. And then they used that as sort of a gateway drug to actually see the rest of what I was talking about. And I think that the same holds true for politics in most situations. So the important thing if you're pushing conservatism is to find the flashpoints. This is true for everybody in politics, right, left, and center, so it's also true for conservatives. And that is, you find a flashpoint that inherently supports your position, and then you say, this is why you need to get politically engaged. And you have to find out what the person is really interested in. Not everybody is interested in the same issues. There's some people who are very interested in the unborn. There are some people who are very interested in gun rights. I see the NRA hat. There are a bunch of people who are very interested in economic liberty. There are a bunch of people who are libertarian and just don't want the government involved in their business. And so you have to sort of identify what issue motivates somebody as a general rule, and then determine how you make the approach politically on a hot button issue that's in the news, because that's first people have to be interested, and what makes people interested is those hot button flashpoints in politics. It's not you telling somebody to go out and read Frederick Hayek. It's not going to happen.
Would it be all right if I got a picture with you?
I'd be happy to do that after. I think that we'll probably try and stick around a little bit. Do that.
Hi.
Howdy.
So let's say hypothetically there's a young man here who is dating a young woman who tends to lean very far left.
So sorry. Before you go any further, is she present right now?
No, she is not.
Okay, good. So I can be honest. All right.
All right, so how might, do you have any advice for how this young man might go about exposing her to some new ideas without the relationship crashing and burning?
Oh, you're an optimist. Okay. So, you, my friend, are making a very large mistake. I'm sure she's wonderful. I'm sure she's supremely attractive. I'm sure all of those things. It depends what the relationship is for. Are you in it for marriage, or like you actually have to give me what's the end goal here?
Yeah, marriage.
Okay, so if you're in it for marriage, then the number one thing you must have in common with your spouse is values. You don't have interests come after values. But most people are interested in lots of things. There are lots of interesting things in the world. Liking the same movies, liking the same art, virtually worthless. What is important is that you have the same value system. So politics are a reflection of values. Now, there are a lot of people who never connect their politics with their values. So you have to determine whether she's politically left because this represents some core values, or just because she's been told a bunch of slogans and now she repeats all these slogans. So when I first dated my wife, for example, my wife thought of herself as pro-choice. And then the more that we discussed the issue, it became very clear to her that she was actually pro-life and hadn't really considered the issue in a serious way. It was just she was told on college campus that it was a good thing to be pro-choice, and so she said she was pro-choice. And the same thing was true of gun rights, for example. She didn't know anything about guns. She'd been told guns were bad, and then when I explained gun rights to her, and when it turned out that her father was a member of the military, then she shifted a little bit. Politics is the tip of the iceberg. The question is whether your girlfriend's politics, or this unnamed person's girlfriend's politics, are a floating bit of flotsam on the top of the ocean, or whether there's actually a structural underpinning for what she's thinking. So you first have to determine that. If there is a structural underpinning, and if she really believes this stuff on a strong level, you're really going to have to think about whether this is something you want to go through for the next 80 years. Because when it comes time to raise your kids, forget about you. Okay, in my view, marriage, not relationships. Marriage is about bearing and rearing children, ideally. Right? My wife and I have 2 children. That is the end goal of marriage. That is the telos of marriage. Marriage was created so that we could bear and raise our children. And that means that we have to have very similar perspectives on how we want to raise our kids. Now, if you want to raise your kid with traditional ideas of virtue and decency, and she wants to raise your kids with traditional ideas of multiculturalism, for example, then and all cultures and all opinions being equal, all behavior being equal, this is going to be a real conflict when it comes time to parent your kids. So you have to ask yourself 2 questions. 1, is she movable? And 2, if she's not movable, what is your end goal here? Because there's lots of fun to be had in life, but when it comes time for marriage, marriage is, as all the married people in the room know, marriage is not the time for fun. Marriage is when it comes time for marriage. Not totally true. I love my wife and we have a great marriage, but see, I know she's watching. But when it comes time for marriage, it is deeply important that you put values before all of the other ancillary things. If you have values in common, your marriage can outlast anything. If you don't have values in common, then the first break and the thing's over.
Hey, Ben.
Hey.
I'm the founding chairman of the Young Americas for Freedom here on campus. We're almost an official group. You just have to recognize us. We have 2 people to go, so that's good news. I'm also a convert from Milo Yiannopoulos to you, which is pretty good. But my question...
you discovered virtue. Congratulations.
Yes. Thank you. One issue here on campus is renaming buildings. One of our buildings is named Kaufman Union. It's after one of our former presidents, and he's been accused of racism and anti-Semitism. In your opinion, should we apply today's values to the past in renaming monuments and buildings?
So, as a general rule, I think not. I think that monuments, the names on buildings, this is actually a good educational opportunity. I don't like the phrase teachable moment, but they usually are. So this idea that we're going to chip off all of the names from old buildings, I think that's foolish. I think it's actually very important as a country for us to face up to the problems that we've had in the past. So over at Princeton, there's the Woodrow Wilson College over at Princeton, and they were talking about whether they were going to chip his name off the building. I think Woodrow Wilson was one of the worst presidents we ever had. I think Woodrow Wilson was a terrible human being. But I think it would be important to actually mention that. Right? He was the president of Princeton, and I think it's important to say, listen, there was a time in our history that racism was not just a thing, it was a dominant thing. There was a time in our history where the First Amendment was not protected. There was a time in our history where the birth of a nation was screened in the White House by this guy. Right? The movie about the glories of the KKK was screened in the White House for Woodrow Wilson. I think all of that is useful, and I think all of that is good, because if we don't know our history, number one, we don't know how far we've come, and number two, it's a reminder of how things can go bad if we revert back into our tribal nature. So I don't know anything about the person who you mentioned, but if it turns out that that person did a lot of terrible things, then I think it's important to recognize that people are people. There's a mixed legacy usually with a lot of these folks. Thomas Jefferson was one of the great thinkers in human history, and he held slaves, and he had 6 children by Sally Hemings. You know, that is a horrible, evil thing to do. But that doesn't mean that everything that he ever did was terrible. So I think that it's important that we recognize what we've done right in the past, what we've done wrong in the past, and it's a mistake to obliterate history. I just think and that's not just my perspective. That's the perspective of Condoleezza Rice, who said the same thing, and I think she's absolutely correct.
Hey, Ben.
Howdy.
So I've been following you since your Piers Morgan interview years back. That was awesome. Question. So I hear you put a lot of emphasis on the free market, fixing, for example, like racism and being self-regulatory. A pure example of this is if a business refuses business to a minority, a competing business will pop up and steal the business of folks who found the former business immoral, and that will run the racist business out of business. If you're following me here.
I got you.
All right, so with a country so large as the United States, couldn't there still be enough niche market to keep the original business afloat? If there is enough of a niche market to keep it afloat, does the government have the responsibility to make it illegal to refuse service based on the color of someone's skin, or do you see that as government overreach setting bad precedents?
So I think that there's certainly niche markets for racism. I mean, there's still people who sell racist crap online and do just fine with it. But the question is, are these people who are going to thrive? And also, are we willing to sacrifice your right to freedom of association in order to crack down on a few bad actors? And this is always the question when it comes to rights. It's the same question with gun rights. Are we willing to crack down on hundreds of millions of, on 100 million gun owners in the United States in order to get the few bad actors? Are we willing to crack down on freedom of association for hundreds of millions of people in order so that we get a few bad actors, particularly when the market prevents these people from becoming wildly successful? They are punished by the market because if you're a racist, you can only cater to that niche as opposed to being able to cater to a broader possible audience. The best example of integration, by the way, through the free market is Woolworths, the Woolworths counter, which was boycotted in 1960 before the Civil Rights Act by a bunch of black students who walked in and they said that they wanted to be served. And the restaurant said, well, by local law, we cannot serve you. And they said, well, we're just going to sit here until you do. And pretty soon the entire Woolworths chain changed its segregation policy. And that's because there were a bunch of people who said, we're not going to shop there anymore, right? The Montgomery bus boycott is another example of this sort of stuff working. I think that that is effective. I think it's actually more effective now than it was then, because then you were at least bound by location. Right? What if there was no competing business that could find a place to rent across the street? Now everything's online. So you can get anything online. Now, all these people who are walking into Christian bakers and demanding that they serve their same-sex wedding, first of all, if you can't find a gay baker in the United States, I don't know where you live. But second of all, there are lots of cake-making companies that you can go online and just buy a cake from them. And if that Christian is willing to lose the business, well, then the Christian's willing to lose the business. It seems to me that's a much better cure for the problem of supposed discrimination than saying that we are going as a government to regulate who you can and cannot serve as a client. As I pointed this out to Jimmy Kimmel, who was doing this, one of my favorite punching bags. Jimmy Kimmel was saying this about exactly this case with the gay bakers. And I said, well, Jimmy, I would like for you to write me a comedy routine about the nastiness and horrors of Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, and I demand you do so right now. Right? This is your skill set. How dare you deny me service? Just because I'm a conservative, you're going to deny me service? That's discrimination. How could you do such a thing? The same principle that allows Jimmy Kimmel to refuse me service allows the Christian couple to refuse to serve the same-sex wedding. And I'm pretty extreme when it comes to the freedom of association. I think that you should be able to reject anybody from your business you want to, even if you're a piece of crap and you reject people you really shouldn't.
Are you still going to push for a debate with Kimmel?
Oh, I'm happy to debate Jimmy Kimmel anytime, anywhere. He can wake me up in the middle of the night. Let's do it.
Hi, how's it going? So yeah, I was a socialist in 8th grade, actually, until I got cognitive dissonance watching your Piers Morgan interview. Mm-hmm. But since then, I'm a senior now in high school, and I founded the YAF chapter. And
good for you. That's great.
So yeah, I mean, it would be great if we could get a photo for publicity. It'd be great for the city.
Yeah, like I say, we'll try and get some photos afterward.
But so yeah, when you're arguing with atheists, in the end of the argument of morality, there's almost always a concession that there's no objective right or wrong. As a Christian or a religious person, how can we prove that there's an objective morality without explicitly citing religion?
So there's two basic approaches to morality, both of which rely on an unmoved mover. One is the more secular Greek approach, and one is the Judeo-Christian approach. The Judeo-Christian approach is revelation, right? Either in the Judaic version, God came down on a mountaintop and informed people what was good and what was right and what was wrong, and what we should do and what we should not. And in the Christian version, Jesus came to earth and gave a moral code. So there's revelation, and then there's the Greek teleology, which essentially suggests that there's an unmoved mover that caused the universe to be the way that it is, and in the very nature of the universe itself, you can discover rules for living. So this is the difference between the Aristotelian good, for example, and what you would consider just moral good. So you might say that something happens and that's bad or that's good. What Aristotle would say is it's not that something happens and it's bad or good, it's fit or unfit, meaning that certain things are created for certain purposes. So, for example, what makes a shovel good is its capacity to dig, right? So a good shovel, the way he uses good is this way. A good shovel is a shovel that you can dig with. A good man is a man who can reason, right? Because what man is uniquely created to do is reason. What human beings, or people, as Justin Trudeau would say, are capable of doing is reasoning. And so the more you use your reason, that is what you were put on earth to do. And then you can derive a certain set of rules. People were meant to do justice based on the nature of who people are. People were meant to get married and have babies based on the nature of what sex is. Right? So you can derive some rules from that. Now, that was basically, I would say, torn apart by a lot of Enlightenment thinkers, ranging from David Hume to Voltaire to Spinoza. But I don't know that they sufficiently reject that argument, because then they go find a moral system on their own, or either they find an arbitrary moral system, or they try to reconstruct a moral system based on premises that are not available in nature. Right? They try to set up universal principles like Kant tries to do, but that's a universal principle Kant came up with, so it's inherently subjective. So you either, if you want an objective morality, you either have to go to the nature of things and try to derive from the nature of things what you ought to do. You have to connect to is and ought in a way that David Hume would not like. Or you have to go to Revelation and say, here is what God actually said to human beings and instructed them to do. Now, the good news is that the vast majority of things that the Greeks thought were good are also the same things that are thought good in Judeo-Christian systems of thought, which is what Aquinas says, what Maimonides says, it's what Augustine says, even though he was attempting to draw some distinctions. Christianity, historically speaking, was maybe the first attempt to actually meld the thought of Judaic thought with Greek thought, which is why the New Testament is written in Greek as opposed to being written in Aramaic or Hebrew, which was the parlance of the time. So all of that is a very long way and a historical way to say that no one has yet come up with a system of morality that is objectively verifiable and that actually gives us all the things we want outside of the history that I just gave to you. So this is what I said to Sam Harris. So Sam Harris comes to a lot of the same moral conclusions that I do, right? That we have individual rights, and that we as individual human beings shouldn't hurt each other, and that we have the right to free speech, and that we have the right to property. And what I said to him is there's an entire 3,000 year history to get us to those rights, right? Born out of Judeo-Christian and Greek thought. And you're just taking the cherry off the top and proclaiming that this is obvious to everyone. And clearly that's not the case, because for the vast majority of people on Earth for all of human time, that is not true. And this has been our main disagreement. And again, I think that it's very difficult for Sam or for atheists generally to get to a moral system that is not arbitrary. It may be a system that I agree with. They may have morality that I agree with, but it's hard for them to say this is objectively true on any level without some appeal to either the nature of things or some appeal to God himself.
Hey, Ben, so I'm definitely a left-leaning student, but I listen to your podcast every day.
Well, thank you for coming and thank you for listening. I appreciate it.
Thank you. So my question is about race and culture. So while I agree with you that when you look at white America, it's silly to say that the majority of white Americans are actively trying to prevent you from getting to where you want to be. I'm East Indian, and I have definitely experienced some racism, but I never felt as though it keeps Indians from succeeding. So I do think there's a cultural component that supersedes the color of your skin. But I also think that it's naive to say that it just so happens that the same minority groups that have been historically oppressed happen to have cultures that are less conducive to success. I believe that environment can create culture. Can you acknowledge the historical reasonings that led to these so-called unsuccessful cultures and not put blame on these minority groups? I know that in your heart, I don't think you're a racist person, but in my opinion, to blame people for their failure, for their cultural failures without taking into consideration historical, the history in general, conceals a lack of empathy and sort of hints at racism.
Okay, so I'll fight back on the last point that there's anything to do with empathy or racism here, but I fully agree with you. Like 100, not like 90%, like 100%. I think that bad cultures are generally the result of bad things that have happened in the past or bad modes of thought that have prevailed over time. So, for example, there's a great book by Thomas Sowell called Black Rednecks and White Liberals, and that book essentially suggests that a lot of the pathologies that exist about single motherhood, for example, in the black community, or high rates of violence, are actually outgrowths of a slave and post-slave culture that was imposed by a white society that didn't bother with policing, that didn't care about inculcating morals or virtues in slaves. Obviously, they actually actively fought against it because they didn't want that to happen. And so there was an active fight from against assimilation by white people, and that created an underground culture that's really bad, and that exists in parts of white America too. It exists in Appalachia. So yes, I think bad cultures have nothing to do with race. I don't think that just because this is why I'm saying I don't know why it borders on racism to say the cultures are bad. Like, some cultures are bad, some cultures are good, and that has nothing to do with race. Charles Murray wrote an entire book called Coming Apart about pathologies in white communities that are really destructive. So bad cultures do arise very often from historical circumstances, including historical discrimination. What I say is that today there's nothing preventing an individual from superseding the culture in which you grew up and making good decisions. In a free country, somebody's going to have to break this chain. Somebody's going to have to break this cycle. And so, am I going to? I don't care if you want to say that the pathologies that exist in the black community, black inner city community, of high rates of single motherhood and violence, for example, or lack of institutional wealth, that is a result of historic racism. I'm fine with you saying that. I don't have any problem with that. I'm not talking about historical racism when I talk about white privilege. I'm talking about right now the idea that there's a superstructure of rules and laws that are preventing you from succeeding, or a culture that is trying to keep you down. I don't think that's the case. So the question becomes, if you are here, let's say that on average, the culture in white America, or with regard to single motherhood, to take an example, is here, right? Because there's less single motherhood in the white community than the black community. And in the black community, it's here because it's 70% single motherhood rate, and the white community is 40%. Okay, so the question is, before, thanks to racism and thanks to discrimination, there was a cap on the black community that was here, and they couldn't get past it. Okay, now the ceiling's been removed. So what do you as an individual black person do to change your life? And I don't think it's helpful, and in fact I think it's actually quite hurtful, to spend an enormous amount of time talking about the legacy of discrimination and racism instead of talking about what can you do right now to fix your problem. You know, this is a general issue that I have in all of my relationships. When my wife comes to me and she says, there's a problem in my life, before we even have the conversation, I say to her, is this a listening conversation, or is this a you want me to fix it conversation? And I think that when it comes to politics, there should be far fewer listening conversations, like I want you to tell me about all the crap that's happened to you, because I don't care. I mean, I care, but it doesn't. But now the question is, what you going to do? Right? That's a much more important conversation, because we only have 5 minutes together. Is that 5 minutes going to be spent on all the terrible things that happened, which I fully agree with, that I would have fought if I were there, but I wasn't? Right? Are we going to spend 5 minutes talking about all the terrible things that happened to blacks and Jews and gays and women and Hispanics in the United States? Or are we going to talk about right now what you can do to succeed? Because I don't think that the rules are holding you back. So I've never, ever, at any point suggested that there's not been historic discrimination against black people, or even that current-day poverty is at least in part an outgrowth of that historic discrimination. What I have suggested is that if you are using that historic discrimination as a reason why you are not, as an individual human being, becoming more income mobile and not making good decisions, no one is making the call for you right now as an individual to get that girl pregnant. And that's the argument that I'm making.
Can I say one thing?
Sure, yeah.
So I guess, would you... you have to admit, though, that between different races and different cultures, there are different levels of success, and there's definitely, you would expect that somebody who grows up with being able less to succeed, you would expect that would happen in certain communities and certain
right. That's why they're called
communities.
pathologies of culture. Yeah, for sure. I mean, if you grew up in a worse situation than somebody else who grew up in a better situation, of course you're going to grow up having obstacles that other person has to overcome. But that doesn't mean that other person, number one, victimized you. Right? There's no one in America today, for example, who's enslaved a black person that I know of, or if they have, they'd be in jail. I'm sure that nobody in this room, right, none of the young white people in this room were alive during the times of Jim Crow. So the question is, do we take away from the white people in this room to rectify historic injustices, or do we recognize that history is filled with historic injustices, and now we're going to have to find a way to overcome those obstacles together without redistributing income, for example? Now, I have called for movements, for example, for companies to go into inner cities and make a deal with students in inner cities and say to them, listen, you get good grades and we'll pay for your college, and then you come afterward and you work for us for 3 years to pay off that debt. And I think there are things that we can do in the private sector. This is why I think religious communities are so important. I'm not against charity. I'm not against us as individuals going out and helping people. What I am against is the idea that the government can fix this problem, because the government cannot fix historic inequity. All the government can do is set the rules at an equal level, equal law, equal judgment under law, equal justice under law is the only way that we're ever going to approach anything that looks like a fair society. There's no such thing as a fair society where the government plays God and gives some to others and takes from others.
And so, would you say that we should, other people who are not, in an oppressed state, they should wait for other people to pull themselves up? Do you think that's how we should solve it, or do you think there is a moral
I think every culture in
responsibility?
American history, every individual in American history who has succeeded has had a combination of people who help them out, not in the government, people who help them out, and their own capacity to bootstrap it. And when my great-grandparents got here, they were dirt poor and didn't speak English. great-great-grandparents got here. They were dirt poor and didn't speak English. This is true for virtually everybody in the room, right? At some point, somebody came over here and they were dirt poor and didn't speak English. And that doesn't mean that on a generational level, people are going to go from 0 to 100. But it does mean that we're going to need to move in the right direction as opposed to sitting around and talking about historic injustice all day, because that doesn't get anything done. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Hey, Ben. Very glad that you came here. Appreciate it. Listen to you a lot. I'm attending one of the health professional schools here at the U, and with the prerequisites, of course, were like anatomy, physiology, biology, and yet...
Those are all offensive and terrible.
Yeah, that seems to be the case. We've discussed quite a bit about transgenderism and whatnot, even more than, say, cardiovascular disease. And we've even had assignments...
That makes perfect sense, yeah.
I know, right? We've even had assignments where you would get docked off or not get the points if you didn't say that you would, let's say, even change their gender in the medical profile to the gender that they say, which I think is just terrible. Considering
it's idiotic.
Yeah.
It's fully idiotic. If it says on your profile that you're a member of the sex to which you do not belong, then you are going to get profiled medically wrong.
Certainly.
Okay, if you are having lower stomach pain and it says on your chart that you are a man, we're going to be looking at indigestion. If it says you're a woman, we're going to be looking at something else. Okay, this is idiotic.
Yeah, so going off that, I guess you were starting to discuss it. I just wanted to know what your opinion was on sort of the implications of this, not only like a culturally significant issue that you've talked about, more invading into more hardcore science institutions, especially considering your wife's a doctor.
Yeah, she is. As you may know, yeah. So I think that I think it's egregious. I think that biology is biology. It's amazing to me that people who proclaim that they are scientists are so willing to overlook basic biology and proclaim that people who are fully biologically male can magically become biologically female. We're not talking about people who are intersex. I always like when people who debate this issue immediately go to the marginal issues where their actual is blurring of the lines. People who are intersex or they have some genetic condition, they have Klinefelter syndrome or something. Right? That's not what we're talking about here. The actual argument of the transgender civil rights movement is that people who are fully male can actually become fully female. That is obvious nonsense. It's obviously nonsense. And again, if you are the very idea that a doctor is supposed to sit there and profile you based on what you wish you were is so insane and stupid and counterproductive. I mean, if you're a transgender person, would you really want the doctor profiling you based along the lines of organs you don't have? If you're a biological man, do you want to walk into a doctor and he's trying to figure out how to fix your uterus? You don't have one. It's ridiculous. Okay, that stuff is just beyond the pale. But it does demonstrate the full-scale insanity that now predominates. And again, I've had this argument 1,000 times with folks, obviously, and the use of politics above science is obvious in everything from what you're talking about to even the rewriting of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the latest edition, which is completely ascientific, based on no statistical evidence, and was essentially a political decision to relabel gender dysphoria from a mental illness or mental disorder, was called a mental disorder, to it's not a mental disorder at all, it's just the depression associated with it that's a mental disorder. Well, by that definition, schizophrenia isn't a mental disorder. It's only the depression and suicidality that go along with it that are a mental disorder. You can literally do that with any mental disorder. So it's again, for people who proclaim that they care about science and facts, to say this kind of stuff is ascientific and afactual.
Hey, Ben. So I've listened to a lot of your content over the years, so I think I know most of your viewpoints on things, but one thing that I've never heard you explicitly bring up, and that, in my opinion, is going to becoming much more of an issue, is the legislation or lack thereof of artificial intelligence. Could you expand on your thoughts on that? Because there have been certain people who are calling for significant legislation on that, and others that are vehemently opposing it.
So as a libertarian, I'm pretty opposed to the idea of limiting the expansion into artificial intelligence. I think that there may be some moral issues involved. Once you get to Black Mirror level, where you're quote unquote, creating individual human beings with the capacity to make decisions, for example, and do these things have some form of human rights? But I'm not sure that that's anywhere around the corner right now. These artificial intelligence systems are, they're great at certain things and really bad at others. So I think that's a bridge that we'll have to cross when we come to it. I don't think you have to foresee the moral problems coming. I think they will just show up. So I don't think we had to first see the stem cell moral issue coming up until it came up, and then we had to deal with it. So preemptively guarding against technology that we haven't discovered yet is sort of self-defeating, because we can't predict every piece of technology that's going to come down the pipe. Plus, there's going to be a bunch of people who go around the law anyway to develop such technology, particularly when you're talking about computer technology and not just, like, it takes a fair amount of resources to do this in biology. I'm not sure that quite the same thing holds true when you have the capacity for the internet. You know, I'm less worried about technology than a lot of other folks. I know there are a lot of people who are worried that it's going to kill every job and that it's going to destroy human beings as we know it, and that Skynet's going to kill us all and all this. Yeah, maybe. But so far, that's been said about every technological development in the history of mankind, and then we've created new types of jobs. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this is a difference in kind. Maybe it turns out that machines can think better than we do, and we can just turn everything over to them. Well, if that's the case, then we're going to have a lot of leisure time, won't we? Because these machines presumably will be making good at things. Will be good at making things that we like. We'll have basically the Star Trek replicator. And at that point, when all resources are no longer scarce but plentiful, then we can sit around and watch Vikings games.
Mr. Shapiro, thank you for coming out here. It's an honor to listen to you. I'm Bennett, and I am a junior in high school, part of the YAF chapter that we have. And just a question for you, kind of about, you know, it's been 2 months since the tax bill was passed, and just asking your perspective on, you know, only about 50% of American households pay taxes. And what is your perspective on that when all of a sudden everyone has an opinion on where taxes should be allocated, when only about 50% of households actually pay taxes, and just kind of your perspective on that?
So just a quick correction, you mean income taxes. Yeah, federal income tax, only about 50% of American households pay federal income tax. Virtually all households pay some form of tax, right? They pay sales tax, or they pay state tax, or property tax, or that kind of stuff. So the answer is that it is bizarre to me that, you know, we should give a lot of credibility to the opinion of people who are not affected by a given policy, except that they get tax refunds from the government for taxes that they are not paying, for example. I always thought that the argument that was being made by Republicans on this, that all people in the country are going to get tax cuts, I thought the individual tax cut side was actually kind of dumb, because the people who are paying the tax in the country, as I mentioned in the speech, are largely at the upper end of the income bracket. They're not people who are at the lower end of the income bracket. So it's a problem. I mean, I do think that as we shift that burden more and more toward the upper end of the income spectrum, it's going to be very easy for the 70% of the public that's paying not very much tax to put all the tax burden on the other 30% of the public. And there's going to come a point where people at the upper end of the tax spectrum are sick of that, and they just start doing all their business offshore, which is one of the reasons why I was in favor of the tax cut. Not even because it would help me, because it wouldn't. I live in California. I actually pay more taxes under this tax bill. But because I think that it's important that we bring business back from overseas, and the only way to do that is to make the tax rates fiscally friendly to people who actually want to create jobs in the country.
Hi, Mr. Shapiro. Thank you for coming tonight. Just want to start by saying I was the chair of the College Republicans here from 99 to 2000, former GOP staffer, and just want you to know I'm on the team. But now...
That
said, I work for the university now. Mm-hmm. And you've always been a champion for honest debate. I'm aware of both sides of the argument around you being in St. Paul tonight. With only one date to work with that you were available to be here, you were given the largest available room on campus. And I'm just wondering, your organizers of this event helped select the room. I have the emails to back that up. So isn't YAF threatening a First Amendment lawsuit about your location falling into the victim mentality that identity politics is based on?
So I will be honest with you. I've been taking the information I'm getting from YAF and from the students. So I assume they would tell a different story than the one that you're telling, because that's the story they've been telling me. If I look at both sides of the issue, and it turns out that that's the case, that you guys basically just came to an agreement, this is the best available place, that you couldn't find a bigger hall, that we actually needed 100 cops, you know, that all that is the case, then I'm more than happy to say that I think that that would be victim mentality and we shouldn't do that. What I am seeing is a pattern across the country of this sort of stuff happening on a routine basis, specifically citing security needs. And I think that that's something we have to take into account, and that's something that's dangerous. Like, this is not the first university where members of the general public have been there are a lot of universities where members of the general public have been barred. There are a lot of universities where they've shifted me to other smaller sites. There are lots of universities where they've canceled me outright because of this. And so if in this situation that's not what's happening, I'm perfectly happy to retract my critique of the university. If the university legitimately did the best that it could, and you have the emails to back that up, and all of that, more than happy to say that it's inappropriate for anyone to go after you. More than happy to do that. But there is a heckler's veto to say, and it's also possible that you guys didn't do anything wrong, but what's happening is that security situations are becoming so complex because of the left and because of what they're doing that it's a bad situation for everybody all around. My suggestion is, again, I'm from the outside. All I can see is that I walked through a room downstairs with literally 100 police officers in it. I don't know if there are any protesters outside. My guess is probably not. If there are very few. It's cold. By my standards, and so if you're going to staff 100 police officers, it seems weird to me that we can't do it at a hall that holds 1,200 people as opposed to 500. But again, as I say, if you show me the evidence, I'm more than happy to change my opinion on it.
All right, this will be the last question.
Hey, Ben. With the current Republican Congress unable to pass much of the conservative agenda, such as repealing Obamacare, repealing DACA, and lowering the budget, do you think that there will be a conservative movement in the future that reduces the scope of government dramatically, or will conservatives have to continue to sacrifice their larger wants in order to get smaller victories, like the end of chain migration and repeal of the individual mandate?
I mean, I think that for the moment, smaller victories are basically what's in the offing. I think that in the future, circumstances change, and we're in for some pretty hard times. And I'm talking about particularly the deficit. Right now, people are just ignoring the fact that the national debt is up to $21 trillion. When Bill Clinton left office, it was $5.2 trillion. That is a shocking multiplication. And every nation that has ever had this kind of debt in proportion to its GDP ends up having to take some sort of austerity measures. So those austerity measures are coming. The only question is when they're going to happen. And Democrats aren't going to put those in place. So that means that as circumstances change, it's up to us to stand out there with the sign saying the end is near, even when people are saying that things are booming and growing all over the place. It's one of my chief critiques of the policy of the Trump administration is that they've been utterly uninterested in entitlement reform, which is, I think, the single most important thing that the government could actually do at this point. And Republicans are running away from it headlong because they're afraid of losing elections. At a certain point, you're going to have to you're going to have to sack up guys and actually do something important as opposed to passing tiny bits of legislation that are supposed to please us. Well, thanks so much. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.